On September 1st, 2017, a city of 2 million people did something no city on Earth had ever done. Yinchuan, capital of Ningxia, opened its first commercial monorail line that didn't come from Japan, Germany, or Canada. It came from a battery company. The line was only 5.67 kilometers long, with 8 stations, 7 three-car train sets running at up to 80 kilometers per hour. It was built in just 4 months at a cost of about 600 million won. The strangest part was not the technology, it was how quiet it was. People standing under the beam complained they couldn't hear it coming, and about 4 out of every 5 parts of that silent train came from one company, a firm that had never built a single meter of rail before 2010. Today, that same company has rail projects operational or under construction in 5 cities in China, as well as Salvador. Brazil is building the Gold Line in the largest city in South America and is in a pre-development contract to build a monorail from the San Fernando Valley to LAX. This happened in public. It was paid for with public money. It was in city council minutes anyone could read. Yet, barely a headline appeared. The company is BYD. You probably know the name BYD from cars. Around 2023, BYD started outselling Tesla, and suddenly, everyone paid attention. But here is what most people miss. Long before BYD became famous for cars, BYD had already started taking over the world's most boring and most profitable infrastructure, urban rail. A quieter win hidden in places nobody checks. Not car dealerships, but elevated beams over traffic. It takes a lot of effort to dig up stories like this, so please hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. How did a battery maker quietly start building a rail empire while the whole world looked the other way? Let us find out. BYD is secretly building a rail empire. BYD has been actively promoting its SkyRail system since 2016 in a bid to tap into China's multi-trillion yuan mass transit market. That is not a guess. That is sitting right now in company filings. While everyone was watching car showrooms, BYD was building rail. Think about what that number means. 5 billion RMB is not a small R&D budget. That is an entire subway line worth of money spent before a single passenger pays. BYD's SkyRail is a straddle-type monorail system with an investment of 5 billion RMB, developed by a dedicated R&D team of more than 1,000 following 5 years of research and development. To create a solution for urban traffic congestion, BYD invested a total of 5 billion RMB and mobilized more than 1,000 engineers in a 5-year R&D project. In October 2016, BYD held the global debut of SkyRail at its headquarters in Shenzhen, marking the company's entry into the rail transit market. The first 5.4-kilometer trial line was unveiled in October 2016, linking BYD's headquarters in Shenzhen with a nearby high-speed railway station. This is not a pilot program. This is a parallel empire being built while you were watching BYD's cars. Why? Because it happened inside procurement processes. The most boring place on Earth to hide something. Not secret, not classified, just tedious. Published in council minutes about a beam nobody ever looks at twice. But here is where it gets interesting. BYD was not always a railmaker. It started as a battery company in 1995. It did not build its first bus until 2010. It did not build its first rail until 2016. So how did a battery firm with zero rail experience end up building rail systems on 3 continents? The answer starts with the fact that mid-sized city rail is the most ignored infrastructure on the planet, and that made it the easiest target BYD could ever pick. Why mid-size rail was the easiest target? When was the last time you actually noticed a city monorail? Not when you needed to catch one, but when you just looked at one and had an opinion. You probably cannot remember. And that is the whole point. A monorail is background scenery. It sits in your mind somewhere between a bridge and a street lamp. You only notice it when it fails you. Nobody has a favorite monorail. Nobody drives a monorail. There are no monorail reviews. No executive in a turtleneck unveils the future of monorails on a stage. The mid-size rail is the least defended product in all of transportation, and that made it the perfect target. The mid-size rail was also the easiest rail on Earth to electrify. Not the hardest, the easiest. Here is why. First, a mid-size city rail goes the same distance every day. Range anxiety is a car problem. You might drive 300 kilometers to a wedding. A sky shuttle does not have cousins. It runs the same 8.51 kilometers loop, comes back, does it again, and parks. A planner knows exactly how far it will go every Tuesday for the next 20 years. Second, a small rail sleeps in the same place every night. The hardest part of subways was never the train, it was the tunnel. Building a subway means buying land, digging, moving pipes, fighting with city councils for 5 years. BYD's SkyRail skips all of that. SkyRail brings lower costs, a shorter construction period, and greater terrain adaptability when compared to competing technologies. You are not building a tunnel. You are bolting a beam onto pillars you can install in months. Third, diesel buses are brutal, but subways are brutal on budgets. A metro line costs $150 million to $300 million per kilometer. BYD figured out how to build for a fraction. That is the worst possible condition for a mayor who needs transit but cannot afford a subway. Electric rail saves on tunneling and on the driver because BYD runs autonomous. Fourth, and this is the big one, the buyer is a government. Nobody falls in love with a monorail beam. No brand loyalty, no dealership, no showroom. There is just a tender document and a committee. Selling a car means winning 1,000,000 arguments with 1,000,000 strangers. Selling a SkyRail means winning one meeting. A car has to be desired. A SkyRail just has to be cheaper than a subway and faster than a bus. In 2016, Yinchuan decided to find out exactly how much cheaper. The city was huge, but had no high-speed rail connection until 2020. The national government was tightening approvals for subways because every small city wanted one and couldn't pay for it. Yinchuan happened to be offered a deal by a battery company that had just decided to build rail. That company was BYD. The match was not luck, it was location, and location was about to pay off. The change did not happen fast. From 2016 to 2017, a few demo beams and photos. From 2018 to 2020, small trials, data collection, quiet failures, and quiet fixes. Then, 2021 to 2026, everything at once. That is how almost every overnight success actually looks when you check the dates. The main system was BYD SkyRail, a straddle-type system where the vehicle sits on top of the beam, hanging over both sides. Those numbers were boring on purpose. Yinchuan SkyRail, Line 1 is 5.67 kilometers with 8 stations. The system will start its official operation with a 5.67-kilometer route. The system was built so no road needed to be closed for years. In 2017 alone, Yinchuan spent about 600 million yuan on the line, but the real prize was not the contract. BYD walked away with 8 years of failure data, how a beam holds up after 6 years in desert heat, how drivers react the first week of autonomous operation, what cracks first, how to charge a train that is also battery-powered. No consultant on Earth had that knowledge. In 2017, the subsidy did not buy a train, it bought experience. And experience is the one thing a rival cannot copy, the chemistry bet in the spreadsheet. To understand how BYD won rail contracts everywhere, you have to look under the floor. There is a choice BYD made about batteries that people got wrong for 10 years. BYD was not a rail company that learned about batteries. It started in 1995 as a battery company that later decided to build vehicles around its own cells. Here is the simple version. BYD chose to make rail battery-powered and fully autonomous. Look at Pingshan Sky Shuttle Line 1, the first municipal sky shuttle line in Shenzhen. The elevated rail line runs 8.51 kilometers with a total of 11 stations between Pingshan High-Speed Railway and BYD North stations. The Sky Shuttle Rail Transit System, independently developed by BYD, is battery-powered and fully autonomous. Line 1 opened December 28, 2022. For years, this looked like a weakness. The trains BYD used were seen as too small for real transit. They were small if you were building a metro for Shanghai. But put that same train in a mid-sized city and the problem disappears. A mid-sized city is a 5 million person city that moves at 18 kilometers per hour and stops every 800 meters. Nobody needs 20,000 passengers per hour per direction. There is plenty of room on the beam for a smaller battery train. The thing that made Sky Shuttle bad for megacities did not matter for Pingshan at all. And what battery autonomy is good at is exactly what small cities care about. It lasts a very long time through thousands of charge cycles. It is cheaper per kilometer. It does not need a driver, which is 60% of operating cost. And when something goes wrong, it handles power outages far better than third rail. Ask any transit operator what keeps them up at night, and they will say operating cost and driver shortage. Battery autonomy wins on both. So while other companies chase the numbers that sell metros, BYD chased the numbers that sell to mayors of cities you have never heard of. They were not building a better train. They were building a better spreadsheet. The number that matters to a mayor is cost per kilometer over the full life of the system. That number is not decided in a showroom. It is worked out in a spreadsheet years before anyone orders anything. On day one, a subway loses that comparison badly for a small city. It costs billions. Then it starts costing money every month on drivers and tunnel maintenance. Around year 5 or 6, the lines cross. From that point on, SkyRail and Sky Shuttle are cheaper. And once that happens, the argument stops being about capacity and starts being about money, which is far easier to win in a council meeting. By 2018, this was scaling up. BYD was in talks about 7 years ago to introduce SkyRail and later the smaller Sky Shuttle in about 20 Chinese cities, which were attracted by the cheaper construction costs relatively to subway lines. Systems like it are already operational or under construction in 5 cities in China as well as Salvador, Brazil. BYD now had a product tested in real service, plus enough domestic orders to make the factories cheap. They were ready to leave China and start winning cities across the globe. How you actually win a city. The playbook BYD used to win international rail markets is rarely reported, and Salvador, Brazil shows it best. The dates tell the story. BYD entered Brazil in 2019, not with cars, but with rail. A public-private partnership was signed in 2019 with BYD under the consortium SkyRail Bahia for an elevated monorail system of 36.4 kilometers, comprising 3 sections and 34 stops. The system is expected to be fully integrated with Salvador Metro system. The new deal will bring a 20-kilometer stretch of BYD's SkyRail to Salvador's beautiful seaside, with one stretch of the run spanning a gap over the sea to connect an offshore island to the mainland. The $689 million project is broken up into 2 phases. None of this made news. All of it was groundwork. Then, everything broke open. The SkyRail vehicle, with its autonomous driving technology and futuristic design, will be sent to Salvador, Brazil, where it will operate on a 14.5-mile line linking the city's central business district to São João Island. Before that delivery was even finished, the city came back for more. In April, BYD officially signed a deal for the São Paulo Metro's Line 17 project. This marks BYD's second major collaborative project in Brazil, following the company's SkyRail line in the city of Salvador. As the provider of this integrated solution, BYD will provide Line 17 with an entire suite of products and services, including 14 fleets of 5-vehicle trains, switches, conductive rails, UTO-level signal system, central control system. BYD will build the conductive rail line and provide Line 17 with 14 sets of 5-vehicle trains. The first phase of the Line 17 project will extend from São Paulo's Congonhas Airport to other central parts of the city, with a total length of 17.7 kilometers upon completion. Here is the detail that changes everything, the one that almost always gets left out. That tender was not a monorail tender. São Paulo issued a commercial tender for a people mover that had failed for a decade with other technologies. Diesel, BRT, light rail, anything could compete. BYD's SkyRail won on cost and terrain adaptability. whatever help BYD had getting to the starting line. At that starting line, they were running against Alstom, Bombardier Innovia, and Hitachi on cost in an open process in Latin America's richest city, and they won. Then came the smartest move in the whole playbook. BYD did not ship finished trains to Brazil and leave. They built a local consortium. Skyrail Bahia is Brazilian steel, Brazilian labor, Brazilian welding, Brazilian jobs. In a country where foreign imports taking local work is exactly the objection that could have killed the deal. BYD solved the political problem before it happened. Then, there was the depot, a massive elevated depot in Salvador. Nobody takes photos of a monorail depot, but that depot is what decides the next 20 years. Step back, and the pattern is clear because it repeats everywhere. Win one flagship city on price in an open tender. Build the beam locally so the politics fade. Build the depot, which is the part nobody photographs and the part that locks in the future. Then let neighboring capitals panic about being left behind. Salvador and São Paulo spent 5 years trading the title of largest BYD rail project outside China. Salvador had it first. São Paulo took it in 2024. Santiago, Bangkok, Cairo spent years watching. Two cities racing each other in public with press conferences did BYD's marketing for free in Portuguese to every other mayor in Latin America. And then there is Los Angeles. BYD constructed monorail systems around the world, including Line 17 in São Paulo and the Skyrail Bahia, both in Brazil. BYD is also part of a consortium that was awarded a pre-development contract to build a monorail from the San Fernando Valley to LAX via the Sepulveda Pass. You do not sell a mayor a train. You sell them a photo in front of a silent beam, a spreadsheet the opposition cannot argue with, and a factory in their own country. The rivals and the real cost. If this sounds one-sided, hold on, because the case against BYD Skyrail deserves to be heard. The first objection is the graveyard. BYD's Skyrail project called off amid stricter scrutiny of rail projects. Since the first 5.4-kilometer trial line was unveiled, the company has signed agreements on monorail projects with a handful of cities, including Yinchuan, Yichang, Guanggan, Bengbu, and Jilin. Most ended up abandoned, including the one in Bengbu. Some, such as the one at BYD's headquarters in Shenzhen, and those in the cities of Xi'an and Yinchuan, continue to operate. BYD has also run into troubles in advancing Skyrail overseas. It had a monorail deal with Salvador, but that was cancelled in 2023 due to escalating costs. The second objection is rust. In China, some Skyrail stations rust, a rare setback for the EV giant. The transit world is full of companies that won big contracts on price, and then found that being cheap to build and being cheap to run are two different things. Servicing a 36.4 kilometers elevated system with 34 stops in a coastal city with salt air for 20 years is the kind of test that kills companies. The third objection is that BYD Skyrail struggles. That is not a sales problem. That is a service problem. And service problems get fixed by the second contract, or the second contract does not happen. So why do none of these objections settle it? The cancelled projects argument explains how BYD got filtered. It does not explain Pingshan, where Sky Shuttle opened on December 28, 2022 and runs 8.51 kilometers with 11 stations every day. The rust argument closed one station at the exact moment BYD was opening 11 new ones in Pingshan. And the reliability complaints come from operators who already bought BYD Skyrail. That is not a sales problem. That is a maintenance moat. Now the story takes a turn. China's share of global monorail sales was 0% in 2010. By 2025, China builds 70% of the world's monorails. That does not mean everyone else is selling fewer. It means everyone else finally realized that a $5 billion bet by BYD, with more than 1,000 engineers over 5 years, created a market that did not exist. The market BYD spent 10 years proving viable is now big enough to fight over, and the sharpest fighter is not European. It is CRRC and Alstom and Hitachi. Here is the sharpest twist in the whole story. BYD spent 10 years and a huge amount of public money proving one thing to skeptical mayors. A small, battery-powered, autonomous elevated rail can survive 12 years of daily service and come out cheaper than a subway for a mid-sized city. That proof is now free. It is in research papers, in World Bank reports, in the data of every early adopter city. A mayor anywhere no longer needs convincing that small automated rail works. Yinchuan and Pingshan already did that. The hardest sales job in the sector, the one BYD did alone for a decade, is permanently finished. The benefit goes to whoever shows up next with a good price. BYD did not just build a rail system. They built the argument their competitors now use against them. Everyone was watching the car showroom. The takeover happened on a concrete beam 15 meters above your head. The subsidy was real and large. Rail may become a rounding error for BYD. As their car business grows to $100 billion, the era of open tenders is narrowing as Europe and India tighten local content rules. But the fact remains, BYD took over the playbook for how small cities move their people while nobody was paying attention, and they changed how cities will be built forever. If this gave you something to think about, hit the like button. These videos take a huge amount of research, and it helps more than you would expect. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch the next one. Here is my question for the comments because I honestly cannot decide. The United States has spent 20 years trying to build one high-speed line in California, citing cost and complexity, and everyone outside the US called it over-regulation. 6 years after BYD built a 5.67-kilometer line in 4 months for 600 million yuan and a 8.51-kilometer autonomous line with 11 stations in Shenzhen that runs on batteries with no driver, were they over-regulating or were they the only ones being honest about how hard rail really is? Tell me what you think. I read every single comment. The largest grain terminal you will ever see sits not in Iowa, but in Santos, Brazil. It moves 80,000 tons a day. It has its own rail loop, its own power station, its own customs office. Painted on the silos in letters you can read from a kilometer away is a name you probably do not know. COFCO International. For 50 years that port meant Cargill, Bunge, ADM, Louis Dreyfus. The ABCD traders. The 4 companies that controlled 80% of the global grain trade. What almost nobody watching that port realizes is that the paycheck inside now comes from Beijing. In 2014, China's largest food company, COFCO, bought a 51% stake in Dutch trader Nadera in a deal that valued Nadera at $4 billion, including debt, and a 51% stake in Noble Agri for $1.5 billion. In 2016, the group took full control of Noble Agri. In 2017, it took full control of Nadera. Both were integrated into its overseas platform, COFCO International. By 2024, that platform reported $38.5 billion in revenue. For 100 years, no government ever owned the plumbing that moves your food. They regulated it. They subsidized it. But they did not buy it. 4 companies did. ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus Company. You have never heard of them, and that is how they liked it. They owned the silos, the crushers, the ports, the ships. If you ate bread, chicken, pork, or cooking oil, you paid them and you never knew it. Then one country broke that rule so completely that in 36 months it assembled a parallel system capable of handling 150 million tons of food a year, owning a quarter of the world's pesticide and seed genetics, and owning the largest pork producer on Earth. That country is China. While most of the world argued about batteries and chips, China quietly became the only country on Earth with its own farm-to-table empire that does not need permission from Chicago or Geneva to feed itself. What triggered this was a pricing shock so extreme it sounds invented. It did not happen in grain. It happened in fertilizer. China produces 31% of the world's urea and 42% of its diammonium phosphate capacity, and about 44% of the world's phosphate overall. In late 2021, Beijing simply stopped exporting. It banned nitrogen-potassium blends, slapped quotas on phosphate, and in 2024 reopened urea exports only with a minimum price floor of $660 a ton. Prices tripled. Farmers in Brazil and Iowa who had never thought about Beijing suddenly could not afford to plant. If you are finding this interesting, please hit the like button because these videos take enormous effort to research from filings in Geneva, Beijing, and Des Moines, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There is a strange legal feature hidden inside these grain contracts that almost nobody outside the commodity world knows about. And there is a glaring problem with the entire plan that involves the trip home. But first, you need to understand the invisible industry that feeds everything. There is a lesson in commercial history that resurfaces once every generation to punish whoever forgot it. The greatest powers were never the ones who grew the most food. They were the ones who controlled how food moved. Venice dominated the Mediterranean through its grain fleets, not its wheat fields. Britain built an empire on the corn exchange and its merchant marine, not on its farms alone. America fed the world after World War II because Cargill and ADM controlled the Mississippi River system, not because Iowa had good soil. Whoever controls movement sets the price of everything that moves. For 100 years, the global food industry forgot this lesson. Nestle, Unilever, Tyson Foods, JBS. Every major food company made products and then handed sourcing to the ABCDs. These companies operated one of the most quietly profitable niches in global trade, and their success depended on staying invisible. Food logistics is the only industry that measures success by how completely you ignore it. Between 80 and 90% of traded calories move by sea, and you have never spent 1 second wondering who owns the silo at the other end. You only hear about it when something breaks. A Russian blockade in the Black Sea for 6 days, and suddenly everyone becomes a wheat expert. A drought empties the Panama Canal and soy barges queue for 3 weeks. Then the crisis passes and the system vanishes again. That is by design. Within that invisible world, the corner that controls seeds is even more hidden. You cannot grow modern corn or soy without patented genetics and the pesticides that go with them. For 30 years, 6 companies owned that bottleneck: Syngenta, Monsanto, Bayer, BASF, Dow, and DuPont. They owned the DNA. If you wanted to plant, you paid them a royalty. That arrangement was stable for decades. Farmers got higher yields without breeding their own seeds. Chemical companies ran complex labs across dozens of countries. They held advantages beyond the labs themselves. Patent libraries built over a century, regulatory approvals in 100 countries, pools of PhD breeders, relationships with farm ministries built over generations. It was a closed system with very high walls, and for 30 years nobody had any reason to tear them down. The system was so smooth that nobody questioned it, which is exactly when it became dangerous, because hidden underneath all that efficiency was a fragile foundation. China, with 1,400 million people and 7% of the world's arable land, had decided it would never be dependent again. To understand why the Beijing trader felt forced to buy its own network, you need to understand one uncomfortable truth about demand. China accounts for more than 60% of global soybean imports, and the United States and Brazil together supply over 80% of global exports. In 2000, China imported almost no soybeans. By 2017, China bought 50.93 million tons from Brazil alone, accounting for 53.3% of purchases, while U.S. sales fell to 32.9 million tons. Now hold those two facts together. A country that must import 60% of the soybeans traded worldwide to feed its pigs, and a trading system where 4 Western companies control 80% of the flow. What happened next is not a mystery. It is arithmetic. Demand explodes. Supply is controlled by someone else. You cannot snap your fingers and make a port appear. Building one takes years, so prices climb. Traders realize their silos are gold mines. Every food company that needs soy starts bidding against every other food company for the same pool. The actual numbers are almost hard to believe. On May 29, 2013, WH Group, then known as Shuanghui Group, announced the purchase of Smithfield Foods for $4.72 billion. At the time, China had 475 million pigs, roughly 60% of the global total, and ate 85.3 pounds of pork per person. The Henan-based group was not buying bacon. It was buying the world's largest hog genetics, slaughterhouses, and export licenses. That deal was aimed at tapping massive supplies of U.S. meat for export to China. But the money was not even the worst part. The bigger problem was control. A terminal contract is a contract, and a contract has an owner. If Bunge locks up a terminal in Santos for 5 years, it is gone. It does not matter how much cash you offer. Your factories can be running perfectly. Your order books can be full, and your beans just sit in a silo in Mato Grosso in the rain. That is the moment the realization hit. The Chinese buyer was not competing with Cargill for customers. It was competing with everyone for space on the river. And that realization set the stage for a decision that would make this state-backed trader the 4th largest grain trader on Earth. In 2014, the company made an announcement that plenty of seasoned watchers considered reckless. It planned to spend $2.8 billion buying control of 2 traders it had never run. The reaction ranged from polite skepticism to open amusement. State-owned food companies do not buy global traders. That is not what state-owned food companies do. On June 26, 2017, a second announcement made the first look small. ChemChina, led by Chairman Ren Jianjin, closed its $43 billion takeover of Syngenta. U.S. antitrust regulators approved the $43 billion takeover of the Swiss pesticide and seed giant after they agreed the Chinese company must sell 3 products. It was the biggest overseas takeover by a Chinese company in history. One Chinese state-owned company now controlled over 8% of the seed market and 20% of the pesticide market, plus Adama, the Israeli company ChemChina had bought in 2011. What came after is what actually mattered, and it happened fast. In 2016, full control of Noble Agri was taken. In 2017, full control of Nidera was taken. Both were integrated into the Geneva-based platform, consolidating global origination, trading, and logistics. By 2018, that platform handled over 100 million tons with revenues of $31 billion. The group now presents itself in more than 140 countries with 336 branches, total assets of $71.9 billion, storage of 31 million tons, processing of 89.5 million tons, and port transit of 54 million tons. How did this group in ChemChina pull this off so fast? If Nestlé decided tomorrow it wanted to buy Syngenta, the answer would be get in line. The 2 Chinese buyers skipped the line because the line is backed by the state. In 2014, Beijing issued a mandate to create large grain trading conglomerates designed to give Chinese companies greater control over oilseed and grain imports. That same year, the acquisitions of Nidera and Noble Agri were completed, making the Chinese trader one of the largest trading companies in the world. This is the piece that almost all Western reporting misses. CO International is not a lucky gamble. It is the natural result of a country that spent 20 years becoming the dominant consumer of calories, now also becoming the dominant owner of the pipes. A European trader trying the same move would wait until the 2030s. The Chinese group was dealing with a ministry down the street. It is rent versus mortgage. A chartered terminal is a favor. An owned terminal is a fact. In April 2025, the group proved what that difference is worth when it loaded 2.4 million tons of soybeans in Brazil in 1 month, nearly 1/3 of China's average monthly imports, and sailed them directly to Qingdao without asking Cargill for a berth. But before we get to the flaw at the heart of this plan, let us climb inside the seed itself, inside the lab of a seed that owns itself. Stand in a Syngenta greenhouse in Basel and look around. A modern seed lab has none of the romance you associate with farming. There are rows of growth chambers, each tagged with barcodes, each growing corn edited to survive a specific herbicide. It looks less like agriculture and more like a software company that happens to grow plants. You will find cryogenic freezers at -80 degrees holding the DNA of every major crop. The more accessions, the faster you can breed. Then the choreography begins. Breeders cross 2 lines by hand, 1 pollen grain at a time. Hundreds working in non-stop relay. Breeding a new soybean is 10 years of constant work because every season a greenhouse sits empty. It burns money. Now here is the feature almost nobody outside the ag world knows. The trait stack. Modern Syngenta varieties have stacked traits. Sections of DNA that can be added or removed to change tolerance. So on one variety, the seed packs resistance to 3 herbicides with yields set low. On the next, it raises yield and carries resistance to insects, drought, fungus. It is essentially a software update that reconfigures its own defenses. That flexibility is the single biggest reason the seed giants model works. When you read that the Swiss-based company now controlled by ChemChina controls over 8% of seed and 20% of pesticide, the technical meaning is that 1 in 5 sprays worldwide pays royalty to a company owned by Sinochem Group, successor to ChemChina. Its newer seeds run on proprietary trait platforms which help them comply with EU deforestation rules and give the grain platforms sourcing options that stay legal in Europe for 25 years. That is not an environmental gesture. It is a calculation that these seeds need to stay legal in Brussels. So picture the machine, a building of genetics carrying enough traits to populate a continent with patented crops that reconfigure on demand. It is remarkable, and it carries a problem at its core that almost nobody wants to discuss. The half of the voyage nobody talks about. Every voyage a grain trader makes has 2 parts, and only one earns money. The group loads ships in Santos and sends them to Qingdao, full holds, 60,000 tons packed tight. That outbound leg is beautiful. Then the ship has to come home, and China does not send 60,000 tons of grain back to Brazil. The fleet runs its imports on its own ships, even when that means sailing home with ballast water. Here is why that stings. An empty ship burns almost as much fuel as a full one. It still pays the same crew, same port dues, same insurance, same canal fees. Every nautical mile of return is pure loss subtracted from outbound earnings. This is not a minor issue. It is the issue. It is the entire reason ABCD traders survive, because they never rely on a single customer or single route. Their vessels carry Brazilian beans to China, Chinese electronics to Europe, European machinery to the Middle East. They spent decades building connective tissue that keeps holds full in both directions, so a ship is never wasting fuel on empty return. The Chinese platform has so far chosen speed and control over efficiency. While import volume is over 100 million tons a year, and priority is beating drought or tariff deadlines, that is defensible. But it is also the weakest point. That is why a phrase used back in 2014 keeps echoing. When the Geneva platform was formed, the company stated the platform would be open to partners while serving itself. Think about what that means. The network is not just infrastructure. It is a product. It can sell silo space to other Chinese companies. Your competitor is now also your landlord. That is exactly why a dedicated logistics subsidiary was created rather than simply running terminals for itself. Because the moment return voyages start carrying someone else's cargo, the fleet stops being a cost. It becomes a business. A food company that accidentally builds a trading house is something the world has not really seen, and this group is not alone. Bidawang Group has moved into logistics. Bright Food has done the same. Hunan Dakang, part of Shanghai Pengxin Group, acquired 57% of Brazilian trader Fiagril. Step back because something larger is shifting. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model in food was specialization. You focus on what you do best and buy everything else. Kellogg does not grow its own wheat. McDonald's does not own ranches. This was efficient and for 40 years correct. But it relied on one assumption. The things you chose not to own would always be available when you needed them at a price you could predict. The last 6 years dismantled that assumption. Fertilizer bans in 2021, shipping crises in 2022 and 2023, Red Sea disruptions from late 2023 when major lines suspended transits and Asia-Europe added 2 weeks. Then tariffs, port fees, retaliatory charges. In October 2025, U.S. imposed fees on Chinese-built vessels. China responded with fees on American ones. Both dropped within weeks. Now the calculation inverts. The new model is not about specializing. It is about controlling the product from gene to plate. The germplasm, the pesticide, the fertilizer, the farm, the silo, the ship, the crusher, the pork plant. COCO International and Syngenta Group, both under Sinochem, are the most complete expression of that idea anywhere. And the fleet of silos and ships is the piece that makes it visible. You can debate yields for hours, but a 200-meter bulk carrier with COCO International on the side and a Smithfield Foods plant with WH Group behind it is not an abstraction. It is the argument made out of steel. There is a strategic layer worth stating plainly. Controlling calories has always been a form of power. An industrial power that owns the means of moving its own food is far harder to pressure than one that rents them. That holds whether pressure comes from tariff schedule, trader cartel, conflict, or storm. The Chinese food sector is not alone. WH Group, ChemChina, Sinochem, Bright Food have all pushed into food ownership. This is a whole industry deciding it will no longer wait for permission. Now there is a real counter-argument. A silo is a 25-year commitment. Enormous capital has been poured into a bet that import demand stays strong for decades, and nobody can predict that far out. Owning a network looks brilliant during shortage. During glut, it looks like a giant pile of fixed costs. Analysts have been openly discussing possibility of too many crushers chasing too few beans by 2026. If that happens, chartering gets cheap again, and Cargill and ADM look smart. The farmland story is also more complicated. Contrary to reports that Chinese firms were buying millions of hectares of prime African farmland, Chinese investors have acquired only about 240,000 hectares in Africa, according to research by Deborah Brautigam at Johns Hopkins University. Chinese companies lead with 6.5 million hectares purchased over 10 years globally, but that is still less than 1% of global farmland. But strip away the caveats, and here is what remains. A noodle company that became a grain trader was quoted 60% of world soybean trade controlled by 4 rivals, decided it had had enough, and bought Nidera and Noble Agri for $2.8 billion. A chemical company that became a seed giant paid $43 billion for Syngenta. A pork company called WH Group paid $4.72 billion for Smithfield Foods. Together, the Geneva trader with $38.5 billion in revenue and WH Group with Smithfield Foods now give China capacity to move more than 150 million tons of food a year without a single conversation with ADM, Bunge, Cargill, or Louis Dreyfus Company. And it still has not solved the return trip. Nobody covered this properly because it happened in a corner of the world economy that only becomes visible when something breaks. The thing is, nothing broke, and that is exactly why you never heard about it. If this gave you something to think about, please hit the like button. These videos take serious research, and your support genuinely helps. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. So here is the question for the comments. A country buying its own fleet of grain traders, seed companies, and the largest pork company in America to secure its food supply. Is that the smartest food security move of the decade, or a gamble that just has not caught up with them yet? Let me know, because I read every comment. In the summer of 2022, roads across central China got hot enough to blister skin on contact, while a heat dome sat over 17 provinces for more than 60 days straight, trapping almost 1 billion people under temperatures that would not break. Now here is the part almost nobody outside China knows. In the middle of that same crisis, soldiers were standing in open fields, firing rockets straight up into the sky, on purpose, aiming for the clouds. Not as a weapon, as a cure. Within a matter of weeks, tens of thousands of these rockets went up, alongside cloud-seeding flares dropped from planes and drones, all chasing a single outcome, forcing rain out of a sky that refused to give any. This is the same country that now runs the largest weather modification operation on the planet, a program already stretched across more than 5 million square kilometers of its own territory. And in labs from Sichuan to Jilin, that same country is now testing something that goes far beyond rockets and rain chemicals. A laser. One that, if it works the way researchers hope, would not need an existing cloud at all. This is real. It is happening right now in 2026. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a decades-old rocket program, a beam of light fired straight into open sky, and a satellite hovering above the Tibetan Plateau are quietly becoming one of the most ambitious weather control systems ever built. If that sounds impossible, trust me, it gets even wilder from here. Before we go further, if you like videos that show you things you have genuinely never heard of before, hit that like button. It costs nothing, but it means everything for this channel. And subscribe now, because the very last thing on this list might be the most important one, and you do not want to miss it. Let's get into it. The machine nobody expected. For most of modern history, changing the weather meant one thing: cloud seeding. Planes, rockets, and ground-based cannons, firing silver iodide into clouds that already contained moisture, nudging water vapor to freeze around those particles until it grows heavy enough to fall. China has run this kind of program since the 1950s, and by the early 2020s, it had become the largest weather modification operation in the world, covering more than 5.5 million square kilometers of land, larger than 1.5 times the size of India, and employing roughly 50,000 people across thousands of rocket launchers and dozens of aircraft. During that 2022 heat wave alone, in just a few weeks, China's meteorological agency reported 91 cloud-seeding flights, over 116,000 rain-inducing shells, and 25,000 rockets fired into the sky, all aimed at squeezing rain out of clouds over the driest, hardest-hit provinces. But cloud seeding has a hard limit built into it. It only works on clouds that already exist and already carry moisture. Fire silver iodide into a genuinely clear sky and nothing happens. No amount of rockets or aircraft can conjure precipitation out of nothing. For a country facing shrinking rivers and growing demand for water in its driest northern regions, that limit was a real problem. So researchers started asking a different question. What if you did not need an existing cloud to begin with? What if you could use light itself to pull moisture out of ordinary, seemingly empty air? That question is exactly what leads us into the next part of this story, because the answer starts in a physics lab far from any cloud at all, the light that builds its own path. You may not have heard of a filament laser before, and that is exactly the point. This is not a laser like the kind that cuts metal or points at a screen. It is a laser pulse so short and so intense, measured in quadrillionths of a second, that it does something stranger than simply travel through air. It carves its own narrow channel of ionized gas straight through the atmosphere, a thread of energized air only about 1/10 of a millimeter wide, stretching for hundreds of meters. Here is the part that matters. As that filament rips through the air, it strips electrons off nitrogen and oxygen molecules, briefly turning ordinary air into a kind of low-density plasma. That plasma is chemically active in ways normal air is not. It can trigger the formation of nitric acid particles and other compounds that behave almost exactly like the seeding particles used in traditional cloud work, except they form directly out of the air itself, mid-flight, with nothing sprayed or dropped from above. Once those particles exist, water vapor in the surrounding air starts condensing onto them, the same basic physics behind every raindrop that has ever formed. The difference is that no chemical canister was involved. The particles were built out of the atmosphere's own nitrogen and oxygen, manufactured in place by nothing but focused light. Researchers at the University of Geneva first demonstrated this effect back in 2010, using a system called Terramobile, a truck-mounted terawatt-class laser built specifically to run atmospheric experiments outdoors rather than inside a sealed lab. Their tests, using pulses lasting roughly 10 trillionths of a second at several trillion watts of power, produced measurable water droplet formation in open, uncontrolled air, not a sealed chamber. That early European experiment is exactly the kind of result Chinese research institutions have spent the last decade trying to scale up and turn into something usable across entire regions, not just a test site. And that shift from lab demonstration to national infrastructure is where this story takes a turn nobody outside these labs saw coming, turning a lab trick into a national project. China does not tend to leave promising physics sitting in a single lab. Once a technology shows real potential, it typically gets folded into a much larger push, spread across multiple research institutions working in parallel. That is exactly what has happened with filament laser research. Groups at the China Academy of Engineering Physics have published detailed studies testing femtosecond laser filaments inside cloud chambers, measuring how effectively laser-triggered particles promote water condensation compared to traditional silver iodide. Separately, laser physics teams at Jilin University have spent years mapping exactly how these filaments behave once they hit real atmospheric turbulence, since a result achieved in a perfectly still chamber does not automatically survive contact with actual wind and moisture shifts outdoors. Much of this work has been directly funded through the National Natural Science Foundation of China, the country's primary agency for backing exactly this kind of frontier physics, alongside the National Key Research and Development Program of China, a channel specifically built to push laboratory breakthroughs toward real-world deployment. That funding pattern alone tells you something. This is not a curiosity project sitting in one university basement. It is treated as strategic infrastructure research, the same category of priority normally reserved for energy grids or water systems. So how does something this experimental end up connected to a program that already fires tens of thousands of rockets a year? The answer is that China's weather modification system was never built as a single tool. It was built as a toolkit, and lasers are shaping up to be the newest piece engineers are trying to fit into a machine that already runs at a staggering scale. The machine that already exists. To understand why laser research matters here, you have to understand the scale of what it is being added to. The China Meteorological Administration currently coordinates a weather modification network that, under the 2021 to 2025 National Plan, covers more than 5.5 million square kilometers, over half of the country's entire land area, using thousands of rocket launchers, specialized aircraft, and ground-based cannons. The most ambitious single piece of that system is a project called Tianhe, which translates to Sky River. First developed by researchers at Tsinghua University starting around 2016, Tianhe was designed to intercept water vapor crossing the Tibetan Plateau from the Indian monsoon and redirect it north toward the Yellow River Basin, where water scarcity has become a serious long-term problem. The plan called for tens of thousands of fuel-burning seeding chambers spread across roughly 1.6 million square kilometers of plateau terrain, an area close to the size of Alaska, aiming to add up to 10 billion cubic meters of extra rainfall each year. That is the infrastructure already in place. Rockets on the ground, chambers across a mountain plateau, aircraft flying, seeding routes, tens of thousands of times a year. What laser research offers is a way to reach the one category of weather this entire system still cannot touch, a sky with no usable cloud in it at all. And that gap is exactly why the next piece of this story matters so much. The gap only lasers can close. Every method China has used for decades, rockets, aircraft, ground cannons, all share the same fundamental requirement. There has to be a cloud already there, carrying enough moisture to work with. On a genuinely clear day, none of that equipment does anything useful. You cannot seed a sky that has nothing in it to seed. This is precisely the wall that filament laser research is aimed at. Because the plasma channel created by a laser pulse does not require an existing cloud to begin with. It can, in principle, generate condensation nuclei directly inside humid but cloudless air, the kind of borderline atmosphere that sits just below the threshold needed for a cloud to form naturally. If that capability can be scaled from a laboratory chamber up to open sky, it would let engineers target exactly the conditions that current rockets and aircraft are completely powerless against. There is a very real reason this matters beyond pure science. During the 2022 heatwave, some of the worst-hit provinces went weeks with skies too dry and too clear for existing rockets and aircraft to do anything at all, forcing crews to wait for even a trace of cloud cover before they could fire a single shell. A tool that works even without a pre-existing cloud would not replace the rocket and aircraft network. It would plug the single biggest hole in it. To be fair, this is not close to finished technology. Every filament laser demonstration so far, from Geneva to the cloud chambers at the China Academy of Engineering Physics, has happened at a small, controlled scale. Turning a laboratory filament into something that can meaningfully affect weather across open countryside would require lasers far more powerful, far more portable, and far more reliable than anything currently deployed. It cannot create rain out of genuinely dry air with no humidity at all, and it cannot replace the existing rocket and aircraft network overnight. What it can do, if the research keeps advancing, is extend China's existing weather modification reach into conditions that have been completely off-limits until now. But the ambition here does not stop at filling gaps in cloud seeding on the ground. Because researchers are not just thinking about lasers pointed upward from the surface, they are also looking down from orbit, watching from above. Weather modification on the scale China runs it needs more than seeding equipment. It needs a way to actually see what is happening in the atmosphere in real time, tracking moisture, cloud movement, and atmospheric composition across millions of square kilometers at once. That is where satellites come in, and this is where the story connects back to something that already made international headlines without most people realizing why it mattered. In early 2023, astronomers in Japan spotted a string of green laser flashes. sweeping across the night sky over Hawaii, a pattern strange enough that it was initially mistaken for a NASA satellite instrument. The National Astronomical Observatory of Japan later traced the source to a Chinese satellite called Daki-1, part of a series of instruments designed to measure pollutants and atmospheric composition using the same kind of pulsed laser technology used in ground-based atmospheric research. That satellite was not designed for weather modification directly, but it proves something researchers need before any of this scales up. China already has the ability to fire precise, structured laser pulses down through the atmosphere from orbit at a working, operational level, not just inside a lab. The distance between a monitoring laser and a laser designed to actively trigger atmospheric changes is a matter of power and purpose, not a completely different category of engineering. When you combine that orbital laser capability with ground-based filament research and a rocket and aircraft network already running tens of thousands of missions a year, you start to see the outline of something no other nation has currently assembled. Weather modification, research happening simultaneously from the ground, from aircraft, and from space. Why this changes the entire conversation. Here is the detail that makes this bigger than an interesting physics story. Weather modification research in China is not funded the way a Curiosity project gets funded. It sits inside national 5-year planning documents. It is coordinated directly by the China Meteorological Administration under the country's meteorological law. And the laser research feeding into it is backed by the same national funding bodies responsible for strategic technology, the National Natural Science Foundation of China and the National Key Research and Development Program. That combination, rocket infrastructure already covering more than half the country, a satellite laser capability, already proven in orbit, and a growing body of laser filament research aimed specifically at closing the one gap the whole system still has, is why neighboring countries have started paying close attention. Officials in India have publicly raised concerns about the Tianhe project's potential to alter monsoon patterns their agriculture depends on. Water that falls as rain over the Tibetan Plateau does not stay inside China's borders. It flows into rivers that cross into other countries, which means a laboratory upgrade on one side of a mountain range can turn into a water security question on the other side entirely. None of this means China has a working weather control laser system today. What it has built is the research pipeline, the funding structure, and the existing rocket and aircraft infrastructure that a working system would plug directly into. The laser piece is the last major gap in a machine that has been under construction for close to 70 years. So, here is a genuine question for you. Out of everything in this video, what worries you more? A rocket network large enough to fire tens of thousands of shells in a single heat wave, or a laser that can seed rain out of a sky that looks completely clear? Let me know in the comments, because I actually read them. If this video changed the way you think about the sky above your own city, do one simple thing that helps this channel more than anything else. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next video finds you right when it drops. And there is a next one coming that connects directly to everything you just watched, because a weather modification system this large does not run on lasers and rockets alone. It runs on an enormous, mostly invisible amount of electricity. The next video is about exactly where that power is quietly coming from. You are going to want to see this. Picture two countries standing at the same railway crossing. One of them paid for the tracks, the trains, the stations, and half the workforce that built it. The other one just watches the trains roll through, collects a small fee, and hopes it can someday pay off the loan. That is not a hypothetical. That is the real relationship unfolding on railway lines across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe right now. And most people watching this video have no idea it is happening. For the past decade, while the world argued about tariffs, semiconductors, and social media apps, China was doing something much quieter and, in the long run, possibly much bigger. From the port of Mombasa in Kenya, to the mountain villages of landlocked Laos, to the streets of Budapest in the heart of the European Union, Chinese state banks and Chinese state-owned construction companies were building, financing, and in some cases functionally taking over the railway networks of dozens of countries at once. Not through invasion, through invoices. It takes serious effort to make these videos. So please take a second to like this video and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Up ahead, we will break down exactly how this expansion works, walk through real railway lines in Kenya, Laos, and Europe, where the pattern is already playing out, and explain why almost nobody in the West is talking about what this means for the next 50 years of global trade. The plan hiding in plain sight. In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, a sprawling plan to fund infrastructure across Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. Most Western commentators dismissed it as a public relations campaign. 12 years later, the numbers say otherwise. According to a Congressional Research Service report to the U.S. Congress, China's stock of global outward investment climbed from just $34.7 billion in 2001 to roughly $3.6 trillion by 2025. A separate U.S. Government Accountability Office review found that between 2013 and 2021 alone, China poured $679 billion into infrastructure across 5 key sectors through the Belt and Road Initiative, compared to just $76 billion from the United States over the same period. China is outspending the United States on global infrastructure by nearly 9-1. And railways are one of the crown jewels of this strategy. Researchers at Griffith University and the Green Finance and Development Center, who track these deals in detail, found that Chinese rail engagement worldwide jumped to roughly $11.7 billion in construction contracts in just the first half of 2026 alone, more than the entire previous year combined. In short, this is not slowing down. It is accelerating in nearly every region on Earth at the same time. This sounds like generosity, until you look at what happens to a country after the ribbon-cutting ceremony ends and the first loan payment comes due. A dollar figure on a spreadsheet does not tell you what this actually looks like on the ground, with one real railway and one real government trying to figure out what it actually signed. For that, you have to go to Kenya, the railway that sparked a global debt trap debate. In 2017, Kenya opened a brand new railway from the coastal port city of Mombasa to the capital, Nairobi. It replaced a rickety, century-old British colonial line nicknamed the Lunatic Express, and it was, by any measure, an impressive piece of engineering. It was also expensive. Kenya borrowed roughly $3.2 to $3.6 billion from China's Export-Import Bank to build it, with construction handled by China Road and Bridges Corporation, a subsidiary of the state-owned China Communications Construction Company. In late 2018, a leaked report from Kenya's own Auditor General warned that if Kenya defaulted on its railway loan, the assets of the Kenya Ports Authority, including the enormously valuable port of Mombasa itself, East Africa's main gateway for international trade, could be surrendered to China's Export-Import Bank. Kenyan and Chinese officials both denied the port was ever used as direct collateral, and years later, a team of independent researchers at Johns Hopkins University's China-Africa Research Initiative dug through the actual contracts and concluded the original collateral claim had been technically wrong. But here is what nobody disputes. Kenya's debt to China has grown nearly tenfold since the Belt and Road Initiative launched, and roughly 3/4 of the country's bilateral debt is now owed to a single foreign government. If you have ever taken out one large loan for a house and then found yourself borrowing again and again from the very same bank just to cover the payments on the first loan, you already understand the shape of this problem. Whether or not one specific port was legally pledged as collateral, the country's finances are now deeply, structurally intertwined with a single foreign creditor's goodwill. Kenya's Transport Cabinet Secretary only released the actual loan contracts to the public in late 2022, nearly 4 years after the rumors first started. And even that release left major questions about the security arrangements only partially answered. Kenya is not an isolated case. And in Laos, the pattern looks considerably worse. The railway bigger than a country's economy. Laos is a landlocked nation of roughly 7 million people, one of the poorest in Southeast Asia. In 2021, it opened a shiny new high-speed railway connecting its capital, Vientiane, to China's Yunnan province, a 260-mile line built at a cost of roughly $6 billion. According to analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that price tag is equivalent to roughly half of the entire Laotian economy's annual output. The railway itself is structured as a joint venture. 70% owned by Chinese state-owned companies and 30% owned by the Laotian government, financed in large part through a $3.54 billion loan from China's Export-Import Bank. The Lao government projected the railway would turn profitable by 2026. That sounds like a reasonable bet until you look at where the profit is actually supposed to come from. According to reporting by the Washington Post, the parent company running the line has no revenue source other than what the railway itself generates, and researchers involved in the analysis openly say it remains ambiguous who would actually be on the hook if the railway cannot cover its own debt payments. Meanwhile, the broader picture in Laos has become genuinely alarming. According to the Lowy Institute, a respected Australian foreign policy think tank, Laos is now caught in what researchers there flatly call a debt crisis with no apparent way out. The Lao currency has lost roughly half its value since 2022. Inflation spiked above 30% in 2023. Public debt reached over 100% of GDP. Add it up, and the picture is simple. Laos owes more than it earns. Its money is worth half of what it used to be, and its biggest creditor is also its biggest lender of last resort. The Lowy Institute calculated that full debt service would cost Laos nearly $1.7 billion in a single year, equal to roughly 90% of its entire foreign currency reserves. Imagine a household spending 90 cents of every dollar just to make the minimum payment on one loan, with nothing left for food or rent. That is the national-scale version of the position Laos is in right now. China has responded not by forgiving the debt, but by repeatedly deferring it and extending emergency currency swap lines. Laos has not gone to the International Monetary Fund for a structured bailout the way Zambia or Sri Lanka eventually did. Instead, researchers describe Laos and China as pursuing what they call an extend and pretend strategy. Now, this is not just a story about developing economies in Africa and Southeast Asia. This is happening inside Europe, too. Even Europe is not immune. Over 2/3 of European Union member states have formally signed on to some version of the Belt and Road Initiative. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, Chinese infrastructure investment has already funded the renovation of the port of Piraeus in Greece and the Budapest to Belgrade Railway connecting Hungary and Serbia. The same research notes these investments have made it measurably harder for the European Union to present a unified position on China, with Greece and Hungary specifically obstructing bloc-wide efforts to criticize Beijing, precisely the countries that received the largest infrastructure investments. Money and construction contracts only explain how this expansion gets built. They do not explain why country after country keeps signing up for it. And the companies doing the actual building are not small players. China Railway Construction Corporation alone reported roughly 65.2 billion yuan in national fixed-asset railway investment in just 2 months of one recent year, up 9.5% from the year before, while running 138 active sites across 40 projects at once. China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation, the country's dominant train manufacturer, wins the contracts to supply the actual trains too, recently landing a deal for 17 electric rail units for a light rail project in Mexico City. A small cluster of Chinese state-owned giants, financed by Chinese state-owned banks, is simultaneously building, financing, and supplying rolling stock for rail systems on 5 continents at once. No competing bid can undercut the financing terms. No local contractor can match the speed. No rival supplier can offer replacement parts as cheaply once the trains are already running on Chinese-made rails. Why would any country agree to this? It is tempting to frame this as a straightforward trap, with China as the clever predator and everyone else as naive prey. But that framing misses something worth being honest about. Before these Chinese-financed railways existed, many of these countries genuinely had no other realistic option. Kenya's Lunatic Express was a colonial-era line falling apart after a century of use. Laos, landlocked and mountainous, had essentially no modern rail infrastructure at all. Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF typically demand years of policy reform and transparency requirements before releasing large infrastructure loans. China's state banks could move enormous sums of money in a fraction of the time, with far fewer strings attached up front. That speed and simplicity is precisely the appeal, and it is precisely the risk. According to researchers writing for the East Asia Forum, a country already burdened by debt, owed almost entirely to one creditor, has very few remaining options for finding better terms elsewhere. It becomes locked in, not through coercion at the moment of signing, but through the compounding mathematics of debt over time. The pattern nobody is naming out loud. Strip away the specifics of any individual country, and the same structure appears again and again. A developing nation needs infrastructure it cannot otherwise afford. China's state-owned banks offer financing that arrives faster and with fewer conditions than Western alternatives. Chinese state-owned construction companies, the same handful of names appearing over and over, China Communications Construction Company, China Railway Construction Corporation, China Road and Bridges Corporation, build the physical railway. The receiving country gains a genuinely useful piece of infrastructure. And then, over years, as debt service payments come due against revenues that frequently fall short of projections, that country's economic and diplomatic independence narrows, one renegotiated loan at a time. None of this requires a single conspiratorial meeting or a secret plan written down in one document. It requires only that this pattern repeat itself across enough countries for long enough that the cumulative effect becomes a form of leverage no military could ever purchase as cheaply. A Government Accountability Office analysis for the U.S. Congress put the imbalance in stark terms. Over 8 years, China outspent the United States on global infrastructure financing by roughly 9-1. Every year that gap persists, more of the world's ports, railways, and trade corridors get built, financed, and in a real financial sense, owned by a single creditor. So think about where that actually leaves things. In Kenya, the debate over one specific port may be genuinely overstated, but the country's overall financial dependency is not in dispute. In Laos, researchers at a respected policy institute are using the words debt crisis with no apparent way out about a country whose railway now sits at the center of its national finances. In Europe, infrastructure money is already correlating with diplomatic obstruction inside one of the world's most powerful political blocs. None of this is hidden. It has all been reported and studied openly by researchers, auditors, and journalists on multiple continents. Researchers at the Merix Institute in Germany, who maintain one of the most detailed public databases tracking these deals, have logged more than $100 billion in completed belt and road infrastructure investment, not even counting projects still under construction right now. It simply never had one single dramatic headline moment to hang it on. Just a railway line here, a loan renegotiation there, repeated in enough places to reshape who actually controls the routes global trade depends on. For most of the last century, global power was built on oil fields, military bases, and trade alliances, secured through treaties, tankers, and troops. This is different. Nobody had to invade Kenya. Nobody had to invade Laos. Nobody had to invade a single mile of Hungarian track. A country simply had to hand over the money to build the railway and wait. That is not generosity, and calling it aid misunderstands what is actually happening on these balance sheets. It is leverage, purchased in installments, already sitting on the books of dozens of governments who signed for a train and woke up years later still paying for it. Kenya lived through it. Laos is living through it right now. And the same mechanism is quietly running in dozens of other countries. Most people watching this video have never heard mentioned in this context at all. The question is no longer whether China is building the world's railways. It already has. The real question is how many more countries will hand over the deed to their own infrastructure before anyone outside a handful of research institutes even notices what happened. Do you think this is smart, patient economic strategy the rest of the world simply failed to compete with, or something that deserves far more scrutiny than it is currently getting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video useful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what is coming next in the world of global economics and infrastructure. Check out our other videos on the financial systems quietly reshaping power around the world right now.